What's going on, everybody? There is $1 million up for grabs this week on DraftKings for the players. Let's take a look at some lineup options for all of you. So when we get up top to the $10,000 plus range, there's some options here for sure. And factoring in ownership, factoring in the upside of these players, recent play, all of that type of stuff, I pop out what is my best options for the week in a ranking. And number 2 on that list, not number 1, but number 2 on that list is going to be Jon Rahm. So Jon Rahm up here right now is coming in with fine ownership, nothing crazy, 15-16% early on. And he's coming in as my second best player in the field. So it may seem easy to many, and that's just the case this week, that yeah, the top price player in the field is one of the best options, even factoring in all the other issues that we have like ownership. But now the question becomes, do I want to start my lineup there, or is it there's somebody else in this range I compare him up with? Now, Rory won this event 2 years ago. Rory is not somebody that I have my eye on right now. The ownership is a little bit lower there, but it starts to come to this range. Morikawa and Justin Thomas would round out the $10,000 range that I like. I still have Rahm above them all. I would put second Morikawa, third Justin Thomas. Now, there's a couple things to point out here above the $10,000 plus range. Morikawa is going to come in with a decent amount of ownership. I have him at about 15% right now, similar to Jon Rahm, but I think Rahm ranks out better here. I also believe, and I'm not sure many disagree, that Rahm is a better player than Morikawa, although it's not by dramatic measures. The more interesting aspect is what is happening with Justin Thomas. So Morikawa has been playing great. He's had like 4 straight top 7 finishes, and you have Justin Thomas right now, somebody whose putter has been up and down, is coming off of an up week. He is somebody who the past 2 events has finished top 10. He's been solid basically since the new golf calendar started back in the late fall. But he's always had this issue of, will his putter eject him from some contests? And his putter has ejected him from some contests, and it still has recently. Like Phoenix, he almost loses 3 strokes putting, and he still finishes 8th, right? So it's been slowly getting better. We saw him gain 4 strokes at the Genesis with the putter and nearly finish top 5, finishing 6th overall. So he is somebody that is trending in the right direction. He is somebody that won this event last year and has had success here multiple times. So the concern, though, is his 20+% ownership coming in right now. If his ownership was to flip with Rahm, JT goes down to 15 and Rahm is at 20, well, then I'm going to lean to go to JT. It's all an ownership game on these top-end guys, but if I had to talk about where the guys rank out the best for me, it is Rahm, it is Morikawa, and JT in that order. Now we can get into the range where it starts to become a little bit more flexible to build out some lineups in this $9,000 range. So the $9,000 range is honestly a difficult one to parse through. Like, you're going to go through it. We can go through it right now, and you're going to see a lot of solid names, a lot of good options here. I mean, the ones that stand out right away are Patrick Cantlay, Xander Schauffele. Scotty Scheffler is only $9,200 coming off of a recent win on tour. So you see these names, and you're like, all right, perfect. I can start my lineups with 2 guys in this range. And then you look into some of the underlying stats here, and basically this entire range, outside of 2 players, I'm about to mention those guys, is picking up a good amount of ownership here. And ownership is the name of the game in DFS golf. So when I look at this and when I look at who ranks out the best for me, my number one ranked player on the entire week at this event, the players, for how they fit up to the course, not in terms of ownership, but just how they fit to the course, is going to be Scotty Scheffler, who only played here last year and ended up missing the cut. Now, Scotty Scheffler is somebody that we mentioned who is playing some great golf. The last time we saw him, he ended up winning the Arnold Palmer. His 2 out of his last 3 starts, factoring in the Phoenix, he's picking up wins left and right. When he's having bad, quote-unquote bad outings, he's still finishing top 20, top 25. So yes, there is going to be a lot of interest in Scotty Scheffler because a lot of people are going to be noticing that. So Scotty Scheffler does stand out. I'm tempted to not make him a full-on yes, because I expect Scotty Scheffler to potentially and likely be right up there, if not the highest owned, the second highest owned. So you could play Scotty Scheffler. You probably just don't want to be playing Scotty Scheffler with JT and then some of these other highly owned guys coming down here. But Scheffler, if you wanted to even start your lineup with Scheffler at 9,200 and just forego everybody above that, you leave a lot of ownership on the table. So that's a good way, and salary relief on the table. That's a good way to kind of start lineups if you wanted to play Scheffler, a way to get unique there. So since he's my number 1 player, we'll put him as a yes, and then we can talk about the guys in this range that, I mean, they look solid, right? So you have Patrick Cantlay here and Xander. These are guys that week in and week out are going to look solid, are going to be in play, continue to play well. Cantlay had a little bit of a mishap at the Genesis with his approach play, but it wasn't anything crazy. It was such a close contest, or a lot of loaded, solid players there, that if you're going to lose 2 to 3 strokes on approach, yeah, you're probably going to drop outside the top 20, outside the top 30 like he did. And then steady as they come, Xander, who's been playing as steady as possible right now, it really just comes down to, what does a short game do? Is he going net neutral? Is he gaining 2 to 3 strokes like he has been doing recently? And that's going to be basically your determining factor between top 20 in top 10. So these guys are in play. Like your Patrick Cantleys and your Xanders are in play. The ones that start to become interesting in this range to me are two guys. One is Hideki. Hideki is somebody who is going to, I mean, we've seen a win on tour this year, and he is somebody that is going to be coming in with a little bit less ownership. He's missed the cut 2 of the last 3 years here, but if you're talking about distance, the sporadic putting is always going to be in play there. But if you're talking about distance and how he can get you there on a par 5 in 3, really, and have eagle and birdie opportunities left and right. And the putter recently hasn't been absolutely abysmal. I mean, it's basically been one event this year. We're not looking for 7 strokes. It'd be great like we got at the Sony and whatever he did at the Zozo. We don't have those numbers, but it would be interesting to see. The other guy that's in play for me is going to be Dustin Johnson, and I put him on here as a yes, and that is very aggressive, but it is because he will be the lowest owned guy, probably above like $8,000. I have Dustin Johnson coming in around 5% owned. There is nothing in the recent form of Dustin Johnson that should be getting you excited to play him. This is more so just a straight up game theory thing. He does not rank out well for me. This is just seeing the number on a guy named Dustin Johnson, who is solid, who is still a highly ranked player, who is close to 20-1 to win this thing, just like a Patrick Cantley, just like a Xander. He's getting respect here. Maybe it is a little bit high, who's had success. And at $9,800, it's saying I want to take the leverage there. And the only other leverage play in this range would be a Jordan Spieth. That is kind of where I close out this range overall in the above $9,000 range. So now we can slide in and get into the $8,000 range, where we get to get some ownership relief. We start to get some ownership relief, some solid players still. And this is where I think a lot of my lineups are going to probably double up on some plays. So we get into this $8,000 range, and the guy who stands out first of all to me. So I'm going to like Will Zalatoris. There's nothing crazy there in terms of things looking bad. He's going to come in at 8% owned. His recent form is not going to be as good as guys around him, like a Daniel Berger, like a Scotty Scheffler. So naturally, he's going to be picking up less ownership. And he's going to be coming in similarly owned as Spieth, who automatically just brings some ownership with him because of the name. Daniel Berger is somebody who stands out, and this is the exact same breakdown as with Scotty Scheffler. Daniel Berger is somebody who has been playing absolutely fantastic lately. Daniel Berger has been somebody who's been in the mix at almost every single event that we've seen him at lately. This is a guy who probably should have had a victory the last time that we saw him, barring an epic collapse, if you will, and he's had success at this venue. He will be owned. He's going to be another guy who right now for me is going to be pushing around 20% ownership or so, 18%, somewhere in that range. But I think it's complete. Like if you wanted to go John Rahm and Berger, and those are your highly owned guys, I think that's a pretty solid start to a lineup that has high potential, that is going to have some ownership, but it has some upside paired with it. Daniel Berger is clearly mispriced. He's just a guy like, I would say a couple of years ago, Matt Kuchar was consistently mispriced in DFS, especially in these bigger events, and they always get pushed down to the 8 and 7K range. That's been Berger basically for the last full calendar year, not even just the last couple of months. If I had to choose a guy in this range who's going to be a leverage for you, it would be similar to Dustin Johnson, Tony Finau. I'm not as interested to get to Tony Finau because his overall upside, where Dustin Johnson's a 20-1 favorite to win this thing, twice as good as what Tony Finau is at right now at 40-1, and Tony Finau has honestly just not shown much of a pulse at all. But if you had to go to a leverage play in this range, if you just wanted to hold your nose and say I blindly want to go somewhere to get a 5% owned guy who maybe sets up for the course in terms of distance nicely, well, that's where I would go at 8,500. But there's a lot of things broken there. The guy who stands out for me the most in this range is actually not Berger. It's going to be Niemann, and Niemann is a guy that I really like this week. I think we're getting fair ownership, 12% on Niemann. Niemann is my 3rd ranked golfer in the field. There's a chance that Niemann is my overall favorite play when it's all said and done. Right now, he's kind of leaning that way. We ended up seeing him miss the cut at the Honda. He wasn't awful anywhere. He just wasn't dialed in. He wasn't elite anywhere. He was just basically average, and that's what happens. You end up missing the cut, just misses the cut, but he wins the Genesis. He has a good showing at the Farmers. He sets up nicely to this course overall. His short game as of late has been improving. Similar things at stretches last year that we saw with Morikawa as to why he wins so much and contends. The short game went from being absolutely abysmal to just being hit or miss, and that's kind of what's happening with Niemann now, one of the best approach players in this field. So I think that Niemann is probably one of my favorite plays overall. Sungjae Im is going to be up there. I like him. A little bit more ownership, and I prefer Niemann. Other than that, I would go all the way to the bottom, and I would go to Shane Lowry, who is coming off of actually having some recent success at this event. Believe it or not, he's actually ranked number 9 for me overall before you factor in ownership and projections just for how he sets up for this course in this field or in this range of $8,000. Berger is ranked 10th. Niemann is ranked 3rd. Sungjae is a little bit lower down at 17th. So Shane Lowry is in play for me. He's going to be weighing in more so par 4 scoring. He's going to be weighing in from the recent approach play that you're seeing from him, and also the price point is going to give him a good bump there. So that is where I'm at in this $8,000 range. Like I said, I think getting 2 guys in this range is probably where I'll go, whether it is a Berger and a Niemann, whether it is a Niemann and a Shane Lowry, and go from there. Now, that doesn't mean you can't attack somebody from that $9,000 or $10,000 range, but this $8,000 range I think is a nice, somewhat of a pivot spot, especially with the ownership that we're seeing coming in right now on Joaquin Niemann. So a range that I find somewhat difficult, but easy to get different. Difficult to get away from the top plays because they do look so good, but they are picking up so much ownership. So some guys who stand out to me at the top of this $7,000 range, I'm going to stay right away is Sam Burns. I'm surprised, at least not yet. Maybe this will change, and ownership is always going to change depending on the day, and hopefully and likely not dramatically, but it will change. You can check mine out down below if you're interested on Patreon. But Sam Burns at $7,900, because, I mean, a month ago, this guy, if he was coming into this event at $7,900, would be somebody that you were lining up to get, right? You'd be running to the windows to go get Sam Burns at $7,900 because of his recent play and because of how other guys have played ahead of him. That's dropping a little bit now. Ownership is dropping on him. The recent play that you have seen out of him is basically 3 straight missed cuts, but then he showed a pulse at the API, finishing top 10 overall. A lot of that, though, was due to the putter. But if you think you can get him back after taking some time off for himself, but if you think you can get him back to form, this would be a nice spot to attack. Now, the guy that is really difficult for me is going to be Matthew Fitzpatrick. He is way too low owned for a guy who is this high. He's 50-1 to win this event, but Matthew Fitzpatrick is way too low owned for this event. Can get you there in multiple of ways. Kind of your safer option. He's the 13th overall ranked player for me in this field. He's had success here with a top 10 last year. The problem is, I think if it's not going to be Scottie Scheffler, I think it's going to be Matthew Fitzpatrick as the highest owned guy in this field. And when that starts to happen in the $7,000 range, when guys like a Scottie Scheffler aren't 20-1 or 25-1 or even less to win the event, like a Rahm, he's going to pick up ownership, yeah, and like a JT going to pick up ownership, yeah, but they're going to be like 10-1, 12-1 to win this thing. When a guy who's 50-1 and doesn't have that next level upside, or at least not as frequently, I start to get a little bit concerned, and I start to pivot to probably not get to him as much in main lineups. And the spot I would want to get to him is probably just different markets, whether it is the betting market taking a flyer or more so the prop market. So I actually ended up taking his over 9.5 fairways hit on his first round. You can check that out down below. You actually get a free bet up to $100 if you use the code GOLF, GOLF, in the description on Prize Picks. You can check that out if you want to tail that. So that's probably the way that I would get to some of these guys that I know I'm not going to play in my main DFS lineup because of where the ownership comes in versus the upside. So Fitzpatrick, not completely out of play for you. For me personally, probably doesn't make my main lineup, but he does look like a very solid underpriced player. Because of that, the ownership is coming in on him. I'd rather just go to some guys who have been, struggling as of late, but still have some solid names attached to them. Whether that is Webb Simpson, who might come in a third of the ownership, right? A third of the ownership as a Matt Fitzpatrick. And he's not somebody who's been absolutely horrendous. I mean, the last time that we saw him, he blew up off the tee at the Sony, but before that, it was pretty steady for him at the RSM. It was pretty steady for him at the CJ Cup. We just haven't seen him a bunch. Answer's probably not a guy that I get to here. Max Homa is somebody at $7,500 that I could get to. He's kind of getting back on track, and he's putting together a streak, a month at this point, of solid starts. The guy who really stands out for me, though, personally, that I really like in this range, and he's actually coming in, he's $7,400. He's the same price as a couple of other guys who are picking up ownership, but it's going to be Russell Henley. Russell Henley for me is a top 5 ranked player in this field. Russell Henley right now for me is only coming in with 10% ownership, which is similar to Paul Casey next to him, who I also like. Paul Casey, who finished top 5 of the players last year. Both of these guys are in play for me. So when I see this 7K range, I kind of bypass the top part of it. I see Sam Burns and I say, okay, that's a solid option. I get away from some of the higher owned guys like a Matthew Fitzpatrick, play him in the props market like we discussed, and then I start to move towards this mid-range. Max Homa, Paul Casey, and yes, Russell Henley. Henley is the guy that I probably like the most. Henley is another guy like a Daniel Berger who's kind of blown a win that he had at the Sony, but he's been just consistent. He's been pretty consistent, whether it is his short game, whether it is his approach play. The one thing that can get him lost is the off the tee play, which is a concern, but not in a dramatic way, at least not yet. Other guys down, honestly, now that we're below $7,500, the only guys that I see picking up a lot of ownership below this price range are guys like Corey Connors and Taylor Gooch, guys who have taken somewhat of a fall from grace after being in some smaller fields in this year earlier on and kind of dominating those fields. A lot of guys, though, are just in play for me. Siwoo Kim, Justin Rose. These are guys that are in play but are not absolutely strong options. I think that Corey Connors is in play, but again, because of the ownership lower in this range, for a guy who's now 50-1, like a Matthew Fitzpatrick to win this event, but he'll be lower owned than Fitzpatrick. He kind of has this higher boomer bust upside because of the short game. I would prefer Corey Connors at the cheaper price point to a Matthew Fitzpatrick, factoring in all those others. We keep scrolling. We get to Seamus Power, another guy who's somewhat taken a fall from grace. I mean, he has, like 3 straight missed cuts. You'll get Cameron Young here. Both those guys will remain in play for me. Obviously, Young with the better recent form. And now you get down to this below, like right around $7,000 flat range. This is where you're going to see Taylor Gooch come down here, and he had a nice showing last year here. Taylor Gooch is somebody that, again, fall from grace. He's been not as good of late, but he's going to be somebody who picks up ownership just because of the name. And in general, he's just really cheap. He should, even if he has taken a little bit of a fall, should probably be around that $7,500 range. And then we move down to the 7K flat. Keith Mitchell is like a top 10 player ranked for me in this field. I'll have to look more into that. He's 131 to win this one. His recent form has been solid. I mean, Arnold Palmer wasn't great, but before that, you're seeing a bunch of top 10 finishes at Phoenix. You're seeing the approach play click. You're seeing, as it always is, hit or miss on the putter. So that is something I'll look into. I'm not going to die on that hill. Going down, though, Tom Hogue is a little bit more consistent. This range of 7K plus is interesting to me. Like, all these guys I kind of want to just put a yes on. I'm talking Tom Hogue, Chris Kirk, Lonto Griffin, Alex Noren, and Sepp Straka. You've had guys in this range basically win recently. You've had guys consistently competing and have solid outings. Tom Hogue, talking about Sepp Straka, recent winning. Alex Noren at these price tags. So I'm down at this range right now, and I'm looking at what the ownership is on these 7K flat guys. I'm getting Chris Kirk and Alexander Noren to pay like 8 to 10% owned. Other than those two guys, so if you just wanted to get away from Chris Kirk and Noren and do something like this, make them maybes because of their ownership. Other than those two guys, though, everybody else here is looking pretty dang solid. And because of that, as we move into the $6,000 range, because of that, myself and many others for that matter are just not going to be as interested in guys in the 6K range. Like, yes, will I have some guys in a player pool of a bunch of lineups? Brian Harmon, who's finished, I almost said Matt Harmon. Brian Harmon, who's finished great here the last couple of years. Patton Kizzaire's in this range, and he at least grades out well, but well is still outside the top 25 for me in my overall ranking. So I'm looking at this 6K range, and then I look at the ownership. None of these guys are pushing more than 2 or 3%, and a lot of them aren't pushing more than 1%, which is typical, but sometimes you get a guy spike for 5, 6, 7% because they're so low owned, but because of how good that 7K flat range is that we just looked at, going basically from Tom Hogue, even Matt McNeely to an extent, but really Tom Hogue down to Sepp Straka. Because of that range, it just makes the 6K range look really unappealing. If I had to choose a guy in this range, I would go to Johnny Vegas, somebody who's had past success here, somebody who does spike when it comes to tee to green play, ball striking, the iron, all of that. That's the main guy I would choose between, let's say, $6,500 and $6,900. Other than that, maybe Andrew Putnam. We can go to below $6,500. If you're looking to pair two guys up top together, you're going to need to go down to this range. There's basically two guys who would stand out for me: Sam Ryder at $6,300 and Pat Perez at $6,400. There is not much that I'm going to say to stand on that hill, but they've been making cuts recently. Maybe not as much success here. If I had to choose between the two of them, I would go for Sam Ryder, who has looked at least a little bit better, right? Not as good at the Arnold Palmer, but decent at the Honda, Genesis, Phoenix, which some of those were nowhere near. The Genesis CS, a loaded feel like this. Some of them were not, though, like a Honda. That is where I would go to. A Sam Ryder at 63 is probably the lowest that I end up getting to. So there you go. Check it out. You can check out if you want to get the Matthew Fitzpatrick prop, or just strategy-wise in general. I would take props or different types of things if you like a guy this week, but you just don't want to factor in or take all that ownership if it's a Scotty, a Matthew Fitzpatrick, a Berger, whoever it might be. But I appreciate you all tuning in a ton. Best of luck this week, and go win $1 million Rooskies.